The Sunday morning began with small sounds: a sliding drawer, a car door closing somewhere in the housing area, the distant whine of a truck changing gears on the road that climbed toward the ridge. In the small bedroom just off the narrow hallway of a Navy housing unit at Kaneohe Bay, John William Finn was awake before the first bomb hit, and did not yet know it. He heard engines first. Not the slow, even pulse of a PBY warming up on the ramp, not the mutter of a station truck or a launch out in the bay, but a tight, high drone that rose and fell in waves. For a second he lay still, listening, trying to fit the sound into something familiar. It did not fit. It was too many engines at once, revving too hard, too high. A knock hammered on his front door. The sound jumped down the hallway, flat against thin walls. Another knock, harder. Finn swung his legs off the bed, reached for his trousers draped over a chair. "John, they want you at the squadron, right now." The voice came through the wood, urgent and short. It was not the cadence of a normal Sunday summons. He pulled the door open a crack, shirt still unbuttoned, and saw a face he knew from the station, eyes wide, jaw tight. Behind him, past the little front yard, past the neat line of houses, the eastern sky over Kaneohe was already marked by smoke, thin gray fingers climbing upward. Finn did not ask questions. The engines were louder now, overlapping in a woven, metallic roar. He dressed by habit, the same motions he had learned in decades of service: shirt, belt, trousers, socks, shoes, while his mind tried to catch up to the noise. He stepped outside and the air carried a smell he did recognize: burning fuel. The road from the housing area to the station proper curved past open ground and a line of trees that barely interrupted the view. As he drove, the noise resolved into individual machines, aircraft, a formation. He watched them cross the sky in a loose pattern, sunlight flashing off wings marked with red circles he had only seen in recognition manuals. The Japanese Hinomaru was no longer a diagram. It was painted on real metal, moving above his head, gliding into attack dives toward his station. At Kaneohe Bay, aircraft were burning on the line. PBY Catalinas that had spent their careers crawling across long ocean distances now sat exposed on the ramps, wings broad and vulnerable, fuel tanks full. Some already burned, a hard orange flame eating into aluminum, smoke rolling low and thick. Others were being strafed, lines of impact flashing across hulls and wings, tearing fabric, denting metal. Men were running in every direction, some toward hangars, some away from them, some simply trying to get low. Finn stepped out of the car into grit and heat. The shock of it was immediate and total. This was not an exercise, not a misfire, not a drill gone wrong. Japanese carrier planes were over Hawaii, attacking his base, and the long chain of assumptions that had made this Sunday morning feel safe was gone in the time it took a bomb to fall. He had no rifle in his hands when he arrived. He had no helmet on his head. He had a habit of work, a lifetime of dealing with guns and the men who used them. As Chief Aviation Ordnance Man of Patrol Squadron 14, his world was supposed to be the inside of the weapon: springs, pins, feed mechanisms, ammo belts, mounting lugs. His responsibility was to make sure guns worked for other men. That morning, there was no time to hand them off. He saw a .50 caliber Browning on a training stand near one of the hangars, a heavy machine gun meant for drills and familiarization. The gun sat idle, steel dark and ready, bolted to a simple pedestal mount. The sky above it was full of Japanese aircraft turning in toward the bay. He moved toward the gun without deciding. Its mass was known to him in the way a mechanic knows the weight of a wrench. He grabbed the cradle, felt the cold metal under his palms, and barked at the nearest man with a vehicle to bring it around. They heaved the mount up, half carrying, half dragging, and shoved it onto a wheeled platform. The truck's engine coughed, caught, and began to pull. Instead of hauling the gun toward the shelter of a hangar or under the broken shadow of a revetment, Finn pointed to open ground. The driver looked once at the empty patch of tarmac and grass, then at the sky. Bombs were still falling. Tracers still stitched across the station. He drove where Finn told him. They stopped in a place with no cover at all, an exposed patch that offered one thing only, a clean field of fire. The aircraft overhead would have to cross above this spot in their runs. The gun mount settled with a jolt as they dropped it down. Finn climbed behind it, set his feet, and laid his hands on the grips. The metal of the Browning M2 was cool, despite the heat in the air. A belt of .50 caliber rounds lay ready, a chain of brass and lead and jacketed steel. He checked the feed by touch, the way he had 1,000 times in calmer conditions, making sure each round lay where it should, properly aligned with the feedway. He racked the charging handle, feeling the heavy spring compress and release, the bolt sliding forward into battery. Above him, Japanese aircraft rolled into another pass over Kaneohe. Below them, on a piece of ground no one had designed as a fighting position, one ordnanceman braced his legs, lowered his head behind the line of sights, and accepted a job that did not fit into any peacetime manual: hold back a sky. The first burst went out as a solid line. The gun kicked straight back into his shoulders, a mechanical rhythm of recoil and return. Each spent casing dropped with a tangible clink onto the hard surface under his boots, building a small, unsteady pile around the base of the mount. The tracers arced upward, bright points of light climbing toward the incoming planes, stitching through the space they had expected to cross uncontested. The logic of a naval air station did not include this tableau. One man, standing in the open behind a single heavy machine gun, firing at an entire wave of carrier aircraft. The math did not balance. It was an impossible moment, hung in the air with the smoke and dust and the scent of burning fuel, and John Finn chose to stand inside it rather than seek cover at its edge. Far away from Kaneohe Bay, men on the Japanese carriers had believed this morning would play out differently. In the cramped briefing rooms of a task force steaming east across the Pacific, officers had traced lines on maps and convinced themselves those lines would hold. They had studied charts of Oahu, photographs of Pearl Harbor, grid drawings of airfields and anchorages. They knew where the American ships usually moored, how the aircraft were often parked, how the fuel tanks were arranged. They counted on routine, on a nation they believed to be slow to anger, slow to respond. There would be aircraft on the ground, engines quiet. There would be ships at anchor, boilers cold. The first wave would arrive just after dawn, when men were at breakfast or still in bed, and the shock would paralyze them. In the months before the attack, Japanese planners treated these assumptions like fixed truths. The idea that a sudden, overwhelming blow could disable a larger opponent had taken root deep in their doctrine. The empire did not have the industrial depth of its potential enemies. It could not match American manufacturing tonnage plane for plane, ship for ship, shell for shell. What it could do, they believed, was strike so cleanly and so hard that the question of industrial balance would not have time to matter. In wardrooms and planning offices, models of American vessels and airfields sat on tables, their shapes familiar under harsh electric lights. Senior officers leaned over them, moving small markers that represented bombers, fighters, torpedo planes. The lines of movement were neat, controlled, written in ink that suggested inevitability. They spoke of surprise as if it were a material fact, something they could load onto carriers alongside bombs and torpedoes. The men chosen to fly the mission had trained to a fine edge. They practiced formation flying until the spacing between aircraft felt as precise as the teeth of a gear. They rehearsed torpedo runs, dive angles, release altitudes. They studied silhouettes until they could recognize an American battleship by the shape of its masts and superstructure in a dim photograph. On board the carriers, days before the attack, the decks were busy but orderly. Aircraft were serviced, fuel lines checked, bomb racks inspected. The smell of aviation gas and oil lay over the steel decks, mixed with the salt of the open sea. Pilots reviewed orders written in crisp characters, explaining target priority, approach directions, signal flares. They were told where American fighters would probably sit on the ground. They were told which hangars would hold maintenance facilities, where to drop their loads for maximum disruption. Underlying all the technical preparation was a belief, not written on any order sheet, that the opponent would behave according to expectation, that Americans, faced with a sudden shock, would hesitate, that sailors and airmen on Oahu would be caught half-dressed, half-prepared, stunned into inaction long enough for the raid to do its work. It was not arrogance in the theatrical sense, but a structured overconfidence, built from partial information and reinforced by doctrine that had worked elsewhere. In that view, American aviation ordnance men were not primary actors. They were support personnel, men who moved bombs and checked guns, not men who would stand alone on an open field and fire back at an organized air assault. The mental diagrams drawn by planners did not include a single Browning M2 on an improvised mount standing in the path of a Japanese formation, spitting out a continuous stream of 50 caliber rounds while their bombs fell. There were voices within the Japanese system that occasionally hinted at another future. War games before the operation produced unexpected results when umpires applied assumptions about American resilience. In some simulations, the attacking force suffered heavier losses than planned once an alerted enemy concentrated its fire. Reports on American industrial capacity contained hard numbers that did not sit easily beside the dream of a short war. The outward expansion of the Japanese empire had been sustained by calculated risks that so far had paid off, and each success had strengthened the habit of belief. As the carriers turned into the wind that December morning and aircraft began to launch, wheels lifting from wooden decks into the emptiness above the Pacific, the false certainty sailed with them. It rode in the cockpits of dive bombers and torpedo planes, in the idea that surprise and precision could compress a long war into a sharp, decisive blow. The men inside those aircraft knew fear, discipline, the weight of their duty. Many of them also carried the quiet conviction that the enemy below them would react in ways already accounted for. By the time those aircraft approached Oahu and began to descend toward their targets, the distance between the war on paper and the war in the air had narrowed to seconds and feet. The first bombs fell on Kaneohe Bay, on Pearl Harbor, on fields and ships and barracks. The false belief was still intact as the initial explosions rolled outward across the island. On the ground at Kaneohe, where the smoke thickened and the sound of engines filled every open space, a different kind of preparation was taking shape around a single Browning machine gun, and the man who knew how to make it run. John Finn had not come to the Navy as a hero. He had come as a teenager who needed a job. At 17, he had put on a uniform that did not carry rank, learned to take orders, learned to work with his hands. The years between that first enlistment and the Sunday morning at Kaneohe had been filled with the unglamorous tasks that kept aircraft armed and ready: cleaning guns, checking ammunition, aligning sights, teaching younger men how to load belts without twisting the links. He had grown up with the machinery. The 50 caliber Browning was not a symbol to him. It was a specific object with known behavior. He knew how it responded to dirt, how it sounded when a round failed to chamber correctly, how the barrel heated and walked as the rounds went out. He had cleared jams on ship decks in rough weather, in hangars where dust and oil mingled, on ranges where misfires were an inconvenience, not a mortal risk. The Navy had given him a different education as well. It had taught him how to run a small crew, how to track maintenance schedules, how to keep his ordnance section ready with limited spare parts and finite hours. The culture of his rating did not reward speeches. It rewarded weapons that did not fail when needed. That ethos had seeped into his bones as steadily as the smell of oil into the cuffs of his work shirts. Na's Kaneohe Bay itself was a system designed around long-range patrol. The PBY Catalinas berthed there were built to search the vastness of the Pacific for enemy ships and submarines. Their wings were long and broad, their hulls thick, their engines reliable over endless miles of water. The station's layout, from hangars to ramps to fuel storage, reflected that mission. Lines of aircraft on the apron, workshops full of parts, tools arranged in drawers, ammunition stacked in orderly rows. In peacetime, this arrangement made sense. Aircraft sat outside between missions. The base's defenses were secondary to its role as a forward operating site. Men like Finn spent their time making sure patrol planes could leave on schedule, not building anti-air artillery positions or drilling for large-scale air raids. The same routines that made the station efficient, however, also made what Finn did next possible. The training that had taught him to break down and reassemble a Browning in low light now allowed him to trust his fingers more than his eyes as he set up the gun on that open patch of ground. The standardization that meant one 50 cal mount worked like another, spared him the need to study controls he had never seen before. The ammunition storage system that kept belts ready in known locations ensured that when someone handed him a length of linked rounds, he knew without looking which way it must feed. Behind the scenes of that single figure at the gun lay an entire lattice of policies, checklists, supply chains, and training syllabi. American factories had produced the weapon he held. American railroads and cargo ships had moved it to the station. Ordnance manuals had been printed and distributed. Instructors at schools stateside had drilled into Available men the proper method of clearing stoppages, the dangers of worn springs, the correct lubrication for hot and cold climates. On paper, these systems were designed to produce reliable tools and competent technicians. They were not written with cinematic moments in mind. Yet when the air above Kaneohe filled with hostile aircraft, the abstractions of supply and training took on a hard, visible form in the way the gun stayed fed, the way Finn's hands moved, the way he did not waste time looking for instructions. Around him, others were reacting in their own ways. Some drove trucks to pull burning aircraft away from fuel pits. Some dragged hoses across the tarmac. Some, without weapons of their own, simply lay flat behind the limited protection of concrete curbs or low walls and waited for the passes to end. The station was absorbing the shock, each man pulled into motion by his own experience and fear and sense of duty. The Browning's barrel began to glow faintly as long bursts of fire shook through its length. Finn managed the heat the only way he could in that moment, by feeling the rhythm of the fire and choosing when to lift his thumbs and let the belt rest for an instant. He scanned the sky, not in wide sweeps but in short, intentional movements. He led the crossing planes, aware in a practical way of distance and speed, not as numbers but as instinct honed from years of talking pilots through their gunnery. Some of the tracers he sent up passed in front of the oncoming aircraft, carving empty paths through the air. Some fell behind. Some intersected metal. The Browning threw out its payload without judgment. Finn was the only thinking element in the small system of gun, mount, and ammunition. His choices of aim and timing gave shape to the otherwise mechanical act of firing. The revelation that morning was not a sudden flash of genius or a single unexpected maneuver. It was the visible proof of what a long-prepared system could do in the hands of someone who refused to concede the field. The ordnancemen who might have spent the war behind benches and storage racks became, for those 2 hours, a focal point of resistance at Kaneohe, because everything in his background had prepared him to step into that role the instant the normal chain of actions broke. Above the station, Japanese aircraft continued their runs. Pilots saw smoke, fire, and, in some cases, the thin, bright threads of ground fire rising to meet them from places that had not been on their target maps. In the cockpits of the strike aircraft, instruments vibrated with speed. The pilots had been briefed on likely American reaction. Scattered fire, perhaps some anti-aircraft guns, a delayed scramble of fighters from distant fields. They had been told that surprised defenders would take time to organize, that the attack's first wave would find a mostly passive sky. As they came over Kaneohe again and again, some of them saw something else. A single stream of tracer rounds rose steadily from an exposed patch near the water, not from a revetment or a carefully emplaced battery, but from a lone figure behind a single heavy gun. The fire did not hesitate. It did not wander. It adjusted and followed, pass after pass. From above, this stubborn thread of resistance could not change the overall pattern of the raid. Buildings still burned, aircraft still exploded on the ground. But inside the narrow frame of a cockpit, where a pilot judged his release point and the opening of his diving angle, the unexpected presence of that fire meant a change in mental calculations. Some altered their lines slightly, consciously or not. A few aircraft took hits, holes punched in wings and fuselages that had not been forecast in the clean diagrams of the briefing rooms. Back at the gun, Finn's world had contracted to metal, noise, and pain. The first time shrapnel hit him, it felt like a heavy blow more than a cut. A fragment tore into his arm, another into his shoulder. He kept his hands on the grips, his face close to the sights. Blood ran down his sleeve and dried in uneven patches, sticking fabric to skin. A later burst of fragments caught his legs and feet. Each impact was another point of data his body tried to register, but he did not allow it to reorient his focus. The gun had to keep firing. He did not announce how many wounds he had taken. No one on that patch of ground was counting in that moment. The later tally, over 20 distinct injuries, belonged to medical charts and after-action reports. Men shouted to him from the edges of his awareness, asking if he needed help, telling him to get down, to move, to find cover. He stayed at the gun until the last of the main passes tapered off and the noise in the sky changed, less dense, less immediate. Only then did he allow himself to be pulled away, to sit on a stretcher, to feel the weight of his own blood, the sudden emptiness where adrenaline had been. Even that respite was partial. After treatment, bandaged but not fully stabilized, he went back into the work of the station, helping organize weapons, arrange defenses, prepare for what might come next. The training that had enabled him to stand in the open behind a Browning did not vanish because his body was damaged. The same habits of responsibility pulled him back toward the center of activity as soon as he could stand. For the Japanese raiders, the end of the attack over Oahu meant a climb away from the island, a turn back toward carriers that lay invisible beyond the horizon. In their debriefings and mental records, many would recall the columns of smoke, the scattered fires, the occasional pockets of heavier ground fire than expected. They had inflicted serious damage. They had also, without fully realizing it, collided with a reality larger than their mission. The mathematics of that larger reality were not written directly into the story of Kaneohe Bay that morning, but they framed it all the same. Japan entered the war with a finite pool of industrial capacity. Its shipyards could turn out hulls at a certain rate. Its engine plants could assemble a certain number of power plants each year. Its training commands could graduate a limited number of pilots whose skills matched those who flew over Oahu. The United States, by contrast, existed in another set of numbers. Its steel production, once fully mobilized, would dwarf that of its adversaries. Its automobile plants, converted to war work, would produce aircraft engines, trucks, tanks in quantities that no pre-war calculation in Tokyo had fully absorbed. Its shipyards, spread along multiple coasts, would lay down hull after hull, Liberty ships and warships, until the Atlantic and Pacific both bore the weight of that output. On the tactical level at Kaneohe, Japanese aircraft destroyed most of the PBYs on the ground. The station's immediate patrol capability was sharply reduced. On the strategic level, the loss of those hulls was a small subtraction from an inventory that would soon be replenished many times over by factories thousands of miles away, fed by ore trains, river barges, and assembly lines. The Browning machine gun that Finn fired was itself a manifestation of the same mathematics. Designed in an earlier era, standardized, produced in large quantities, it benefited from economies of scale and a supply chain that could deliver spare parts and ammunition anywhere the Navy established a base. Each round fired at Kaneohe that morning was a product of brass, lead, and propellant brought together by an industrial system that could, once fully engaged, replace expended ammunition with minimal effort. Japanese aircraft lost over Oahu that day were not as easily replaced. Each downed plane represented hours of labor in factories with limited capacity, consumed materials that could not be conjured anew from a continent's worth of mines, and, more critically, the potential loss of a trained crew, men whose skills required months or years to build. The first strikes of the war were meant to shift the balance by destroying American capability faster than it could be brought to bear. Instead, they triggered a mobilization that would express itself in ship counts, tonnage, sortie rates, and replacement curves. By the time those curves fully manifested, carrier groups assembling in numbers, long-range bombers rolling off production lines, replacement pilots cycling into squadrons, the initial advantage granted by surprise would be soaked up by the sheer volume of material moving through American ports and depots. At the personal level, what Finn did at his gun did not change the grand totals of steel produced or planes launched. His stand did not alter Japan's strategic trajectory by itself. What it did, however, was demonstrate that the assumptions underlying the attack, that Americans would be slow, that support personnel would freeze, that fear would outweigh training, were not reliable inputs into any equation. The defeat that awaited the empire was written not only in the tonnage tables of economists, but in the small deviations from expectation that accumulated every time men like Finn chose to act. Each unexpected refusal to fit into the enemy's plan made the model less accurate. When enough of those refusals intersected with the cold numbers of industrial production and logistics, the outcome ceased to be a matter of conjecture and became, in effect, a problem in arithmetic whose solution was already fixed. Years after the guns at Kaneohe fell silent, the smoke cleared, and the aircraft debris was removed, the legacy of that morning persisted in ways both visible and quiet. John Finn's name entered official records attached to words that described conspicuous gallantry, devotion to duty, and extraordinary heroism. A citation was drafted, reviewed, signed. The nation's highest award for valor was placed around his neck by a senior admiral, its metal cool against his skin, as cameras recorded the moment for newspapers and archives. He did not leave the Navy immediately after the war. He stayed in uniform long enough to see changes in technology, in procedures, in the shape of the service itself. When he finally retired, he did not step into a life of constant public attention. Instead, he moved into a slower existence, one measured in the ordinary tasks of rural living. The memory of Kaneohe traveled with him, but it did not dominate every day. For others, that memory surfaces in units of time: anniversaries, documentaries, plaques on museum walls. The station at Kaneohe Bay changed as well. New aircraft came, then newer ones still. The ramps that had once held PBYs under the gaze of circling enemy aircraft held different machines in later decades. Concrete was repaired, strengthened, repainted. The physical scars of the attack grew faint beneath layers of maintenance and modification. But the record of what happened there remained in logs and photographs, maps, and the recollections of those who had stood on that ground. The broader lesson embedded in Finn's story does not reside only in the description of a man behind a gun. It exists in the tension between belief and reality that ran through the first years of the war. Doctrine and planning can shape expectations, but they cannot dictate how individuals will behave when their world tilts. Industrial capacity can set the boundaries of what is possible, but within those boundaries, the choices of ordinary people give the conflict its character. In the end, the image that endures is a simple one: a field without cover, a steel gun bolted to a mount not designed as a fortress, a man standing upright behind it, shoulders squared against recoil, eyes tracking targets that should not have been there. Above him, the sky holds shapes created by distant factories and decisions made in far-off rooms. Between those shapes and the ground, lines of tracer fire climb, short-lived, bright, a human response cut into the air. Decades later, a destroyer would carry his name through other oceans, her hull of welded steel and her arrays of electronics bearing no physical resemblance to the Browning M2 he once held. Yet the connection is there, in the idea that machines, however complex, still depend on the resolve of those who serve with them. The tide of history moves on, but in the record of that Sunday morning at Kaneohe Bay, the moment remains when one sailor chose not to run, and, in doing so, helped reveal the shape of the war that had just begun.